The art world. Let us consider these 9 intriguing red squares, the only work in the exhibition for which any supplemental information has so far been disclosed. The 9 red squares placed on the left are, as you can see, all of the same size and material, but each has its own title and backstory. These are a reference to the first chapter, Works of Art and Mere Real Things of Arthur C. Danto's 1981 book, The Transfiguration of the Commonplace. Danto plans an imaginary exhibition in which only red squares are displayed, all of which appear visually identical, although they purport to belong to various genres, such as historical painting, psychological portraiture, landscape, geometric abstract, religious painting, and still life. On further consideration, this collection of red squares, although lacking a main title, might easily be interpreted as an artwork created by the curator who planned the show, or else by whoever actually painted each of the red squares. According to Danto, it is the art world that determines whether an object is seen as art and that defines its meaning and value. Danto's introduction of the term art world was a response to the emergence of artworks that were too similar to everyday objects to be perceived as art, such as Brillo Box by Andy Warhol. In order to understand artworks that appear much like everyday objects, we need to know who made them and why, as well as the established theories and art history that classify them as art. It is Danto's art world that provides this information. To see something as art requires something the eye cannot descry, an atmosphere of artistic theory, a knowledge of the history of art, an art world. Danto's art world explains why an object becomes an artwork only at a certain time and cannot do so in any earlier period. Warhol's Brillo Box, for instance, would not have been recognized as a work of art before or during the 19th century. The reason why this particular object was able to become an artwork in the United States in 1964 was because an art world existed that could justify it. In other words, in order to acknowledge Brillo boxes as an artwork, history and theory were needed, and the art world of the time had to take part in this course to establish their reasons for recognizing and classifying Brillo box and other similar mass-produced objects as artwork. Danto assigns a special function to the term interpretation. Interpretation bestows aboutness or meaning upon an object, and depending on the interpretation stipulated in a specific art world, an object is given a specific meaning and acquires a position as a work of art. An object O is then an artwork only under interpretation I, where I is a sort of function that transfigures O into a work. I-O is W. Then, even if O is a perceptual constant, variations in I constitute different works. What Danto presupposes in that, first of all, interpretation I is inevitably necessary in order for object O to become a work W. The exhibition calls into question Danto's seemingly valid and still predominant arguments. Danto limits an object in the artistic experience primarily as an invariant perceptual constant, except for modification, corrosion, and damage to the work. And by accepting that the status of artwork can only be obtained through interpretation based on prevailing attitudes within art theory, knowledge of art history, or reasoned discourse, the potential of the object itself is ignored. Moreover, he excludes the majority of viewers amongst the most vital members of the art world. By defining a viewer as one who is sufficiently able to interpret artworks or who is well acquainted with such interpretations. Understanding the relationship between object and interpretation from a viewer's perspective is a very difficult task. Since interpretation is supposed to acknowledge the intentions of an artist, the public and private evidence that supports those intentions, the declarations of an artist, information about an artist, critical reception, and the time period within which a work was created, all of which the exhibition defines as extraneous elements of artworks. Taking account of all of this becomes an act of data processing or form of reading, far from any true aesthetic experience. Such ordeals are certainly common in terms of contemporary art, but this exhibition attempts to avoid demands upon the viewer to conform to research-based processes involving relationships with external factors and the intentions of artists, demands which are all too frequent and often treated as compulsory. The risk of an artwork being a work and not a work when the art world has different ideas on bestowing the status of arthood to it can be resolved by assuming that we have several mutually hostile and questionable art worlds, not a single unified art world. The exhibition is skeptical of the art world of Danto. Rather, for us, the act of refusing to acknowledge such statements allows for an expanded artistic experience and the option not to recognize the object as an artwork. Paradoxically, the exhibition asserts that what we need at this point is object-emphasized forms of art. Such artworks are almost entirely objects, and more valuable than the former in that they give viewers autonomy by excluding most external forms of interpretation. Let's return to the red squares discussed earlier. If there were no explanatory information included, such as the titles or the backstories, to explain their origins, the meaning of the presence of these squares could only be determined by the viewers themselves. This is the reason why the exhibition provides little information. In the essay, The Modern Public and Photography, after visiting a Salon exhibition in 1859, Charles Baudelaire criticized the titles of several works for being overly sensational compared to the actual forms of the artworks, in order falsely to pique the interest of viewers. Extraneous elements such as titles can either lead viewers in the right direction, or else down bizarre paths. Imagine the confusion of a poetic title on an object that is not at all aesthetically satisfying. This exhibition does not insist on the complete removal of external factors. However, we will talk about the need to restore an appropriate balance between external factors and the innate artistic form.